Hello and welcome everyone to tonight's event presented by 192 Books and Paul Cooper Gallery. I am Evan, the manager at 192, and I could not be more thrilled to welcome you to our conversation tonight with Edmund White and Bill Goldstein on Edmund White's new novel, A Previous Life, which is out now from Bloomsbury Publishing. This new book, you might call it White's first foray into speculative fiction, as it takes place in the 2050s as Constance and Vergero, a married couple, look back on their lives with a new transparency that they had sworn never to sort of share with each other because of their previous marriages. They look back on their lives and their many loves and love affairs, including one that includes the author Edmund White himself. So this new book is sort of Edmund White at his most playful, combining his traditional beautiful writing with an irreverent and experimental streak. It's really not to be missed. So we're lucky enough tonight to be joined by Edmund White himself and Bill Goldstein. If you don't already know, or perhaps you missed the previous conversation with us just 2 years ago, Edmund White is the author of numerous novels and nonfiction books, including A Boy's Own Story, City Boy, The Unpunished Vice, The Flaneur, and 2020's A Saint from Texas, which we had Bill Goldstein on for just 2 years ago. Edmund was named the 2018 winner of the Penn Award for Achievement in American Fiction, and he's also received the National Book Foundation's Medal for Distinguished Contribution to American Letters. Bill Goldstein is the founding editor of the book's website for the New York Times, the curator of public programs at Roosevelt House at Hunter College, and the author of the excellent book, The World Broke in Two. And above all, he is, as the Clegg Agency wrote on Twitter, a treasured literary ally, and we are so thrilled to have him and Edmund back tonight. So without any further ado, I will hand it over to Edmund White and Bill Goldstein. Thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you very much, Evan. And thank you, Ed, for having me do this, asking me to do this. It's always wonderful. I feel that my professional life has been shaped by my work interviewing you, as I think we said the last time we did this. You were the first author I ever interviewed. I hope this is not the last author interview I ever do. But
or I hope you're not the last interviewer for me. But anyway, yeah, Billy reviewed A Boy's Own Story, which was my only bestseller. So thanks to him. And and Boy's Own Story is going to be published in the fall as a graphic novel.
Oh, that's fabulous. Yeah, well, we'll have to do another event. Hopefully, when we talked about A Saint from Texas, I think we were looking forward to the next event we would do in person. And you are so prolific that you have published 2 novels during the pandemic. And hopefully the pandemic will be over and we can meet in person by the time the graphic novel version of A Boy's Own Story is published. So we come into this with many hopes that it will not be the last interview either of us does, and that we will next be meeting in person. So
good.
So thank you for having me today, and congratulations on A Previous Life, which is just a fantastic book. I loved it as much as I've loved any of your earlier books, and it's just so alive and so full and so sexy and so beautifully written with so many different voices and so many different ideas. So I hope we'll be able to cover a lot of that today. I want to start though with the title page. I mean, the book is called A Previous Life, but it has a subtitle, A Posthumous Novel. So can you tell me a little bit? We'll get started by explaining the title page of the book.
Well, Thomas Mann's son, Heinrich Mann, what was his name? I can't remember, but anyway, he was another Mann, published a book in 1938, Mephistopheles, and he called it Another Pre-War Novel in 1938. And so I thought that was funny. And so I thought I would call mine Another Posthumous Novel.
So there are many literary references, of course, throughout. But one thing I also wanted to talk about is, so before we get into the book, I've now asked you about the title page. The thing about this book that was so exuberant and wonderful, it reminded me almost, it could have been titled The Joy of Gay and All Sex. I mean, another one of your earlier books. I mean, there is so much sex here, so beautifully and explicitly described, and so just enjoyably described. It's wonderful in that way, and there is so much joy in it. And I was hoping you could tell me a little bit about the characters, a little bit about the plot, and how you moved from the joy of gay sex to the joy of a very fluid sex. There's gender is not, I would say, irrelevant, but certainly there is more at play than gay sex here.
I was just in Key West where they had a literary festival and the theme was desire. And on stage, I said, somebody said, question said, do you think of yourself as a homosexual author? And I said, homosexual sounds so old fashioned. I said, I think in 50 years, everybody will be bisexual. And one very chubby man came up to me afterwards and said, with his wife, and said, we're bisexual. And so I was pleased to see I'd rung a note of agreement. And I don't know, I just, having been considered for 40 years a gay writer, I just thought, well, it might be fun to be a little more polyamorous. All my students at Princeton, where I retired like 4 years ago, were all seemingly, they claimed to be polyamorous. I don't think they really were in practice, but they were reluctant heterosexuals.
I love the phrase. There's a Constance, who is the woman in the marriage with Vergero, and as Evan said, they're writing memoirs for one another, and we'll get into that. But she says to him, when I ask her a question, because she's had some difficult things in her life, and he's wondering, sort of slightly prudishly in a way, well, is she this interested in sex because of the abuse that she suffered? I mean, is there some trauma in her childhood that might have led to this need? And she says, all normal people are polyamorous. You are. And it then, of course, turns out that they both are polyamorous and have plenty of affairs with men and women.
And the weird thing about the book is that, the reason they've never talked about their past is because that shipwrecked their earlier marriages, but it also destroys this one too. And so they're right to have been secretive before.
Well, you're reminding me of Ruth Bader Ginsberg's maxim about marriage, is that in marriage it's important or helpful or whatever it is exactly to be a little deaf. That you don't listen to everything that your husband or wife says or asks you to do. But
yeah, I think that's a good one. So wonderful.
Did you have this idea based on your students? I mean, to set the book in 50 years, or well, I guess now 25 years or 28 years, 2050, in a future of bisexuality?
Well, partly that, but also I wanted to be able to talk about myself as having been dead for a long time. And part of the fun I have is in one of his novels, Nabokov says, it's set in the future, and he said, I'm reading here that the two great writers of the 20th century were Nabokov and Smith. Who the hell is Smith, he asked. And, it's true that the great writers of the 19th century, like Melville or Emily Dickinson, no one at the time would have suspected they would be considered the great writers. I don't want to put myself in that august company, but I think it's funny to speculate on what your posthumous, especially when you're 82 years old like me, to speculate about your posthumous reputation. And of course, I have somebody saying, "Oh, if I'd only written about the great Sedaris." instead of this boring old homosexual.
And yet, did you feel, I mean, that looking back at yourself, I mean, after you're dead in this way, that it brought you, it seems, as exuberant writing as you've ever done. I mean, there doesn't seem any kind of, sort of retrospective view of yourself as a writer of the past. It feels very present. The energy that you bring to the structure of the book too, in addition to the prose.
Well, thank you very much. I've had such punishing, horrible reviews in England from what I call britches, the British bitches. But my friend Ye Yun says they're paid more if they can make you cry. But anyway, they so to have your wonderful words is very consoling. I don't know. When I wrote the book, I thought this is good, but then after all those horrible English reviews, two of them written by old enemies of mine, but I mean, one whose biography I badly reviewed, and the other one who was a gay priest who was dropped from my publisher because his sales were so bad. Anyway, he'd already reviewed one of my books, but I guess he wanted another whack at me. But anyway, that Yi Yun says, well, they're not really critics in England. They're more entertainers, and I think that if they can be really bitchy, that is more entertaining, and they're paid more.
Well, I mean, the structure of this was very inventive and seemed to me to bring, as I've said, an exuberance and an energy. I mean, we have Constance and Vergero who have decided that they're going to write their confessions to one another. And I love that here we all are reading this book, but what the book is made up of an edition of one for each other, an edition of one written for each other's eyes alone, to be burned after a single reading. And yet here, the joke begins at the very beginning. I mean, we are obviously reading this book, and we go back and forth between their confessions, but also just in this delightful way where you'll say Constance said, and then she reads, and then Ruggiero thought, and then what. Nobody is really gauging anyone else's thoughts correctly anyway. I mean, it's really quite lovely.
Oh, well, thank you. I don't know. I mean, I think I've always liked, I guess one of my two favorite writers, or three favorite writers, but anyway, one of them is Nabokov, and his kind of playfulness, I think I admired, especially in Pale Fire, where the whole thing is a commentary by a madman on a poem that is completely different from what he imagines it is. Anyway, I called it in print not long ago the great gay comic novel, because the Kinboat, the main character, is gay. Anyway, I think that Nabokov's energy and his sort of alternation between humor and rapture is something that always impressed me, and I've tried in my minor way to emulate.
And how much, I mean, since Edmund White obviously is writing the novel, but also as a character in it, how much would you say is autobiographical? I mean, I don't want to give away everything that happens in the book, because midway through, when you enter, things take a very different turn, and so we don't want to say too much about how that.
But yes, no, it's very autobiographical. The other day I was being interviewed by NPR, and the interviewer said, "Well, your life seems to have been getting better and better." I said, except I had my heart broken at age 80. Oh, you mean this book is really about you? And I said, yes, that's what it is. It's really about. So yes, I mean, it's very autobiographical, and but anyway, maybe I've always used writing as a kind of therapy. I don't think so, but maybe anyway, I tried to come to terms with my broken heart.
Well, you do say, you have, I think it's Constance who says early on that all love is heartbreak unless
two people die in a car crash together. Yeah.
so all love ends in heartbreak. I mean, it's interesting that you say about therapy, because Constance has written a novel about her earlier life, she says, and she says that she's changed the names. I mean, I want to talk about the writer that she's married to, and what happens in that marriage, but she's written this novel within the novel. I mean, we don't actually see it, but she tells us about it, or is telling Ruggiero about it. And she says, in a novel, she changes the names, but the emotions are photographically real. Even the sequence of events and happenings is exact. And is that sort of what you're doing here? I mean, in some way?
I think so. I mean, of course, the character of Constance is totally invented. And although I like to think she's one of my better characters. But anyway, yeah, I mean, at least when it gets to the Edmund White part of the book, it is quite, I mean, like I quote my ex-lover's emails verbatim. I mean, though he really wrote those. And I made a deal with him that I would make certain concessions if he would let me quote them verbatim, and he agreed. But all this was done very remotely through my editor, because he didn't want to speak to me and has never spoken to me since this breakup.
Oh, well, I mean, I don't want to sound too metafictional, but of course I met him and had lunch with him and know who this person is. But I did wonder about those emails, because I was also thinking somewhat recently of the controversy when Robert Lowell published Elizabeth Hardwick's letters, not always verbatim, but often changed.
Well, he versified them. Lizzie and Harriet. But he didn't ask their permission.
Right.
And I did ask my ex-partner's permission, and he granted it to me.
And so I wonder if it's also true for you what Constance says about this novel that she wrote about the writer, I neutralized all of her feelings of anger, pain, everything. I neutralized them by narrating them. Writing is really the kiss off. Is that?
Well, again, Nabokov in Speak Memory, at the beginning of a chapter that he wrote in French, by the way, about his nanny, he says, I hesitate to write about her because after I've written about somebody, I never think of them again. And and he said, I really loved her and I like to think about her. But anyway, in my case, alas, it hasn't worked that way. I still obsess over this person who rejected me.
Well, at least I now don't feel guilty reminding you of him by asking these probing questions if you're thinking about him anyway. So
anyway, yeah, exactly.
The thing I wanted to say, I mean, I don't know how much you disperse autobiography through the character of Vergero. Ruggiero is an older musician, composer, harpsichordist, but he's in his 70s, I believe, or maybe he's in his 80s, while Constance is far younger. Is he, as well as the Edmund White character, a kind of autobiographical figure?
Not really, no, because his life really is very closely patterned onto all the stories he told me about himself, mm-hmm. and including his youthful affair with his cousin and all that stuff, and his love of Latin and Greek. And he's so clever, he can translate from Latin into Greek. anyway, and one of his favorite writers was, like him, a Sicilian, Theocritus, and I quote him quite a bit and talk about him. But I don't know. Actually, he's like a success. I mean, when I lived on the Ile Saint Louis I lived in Paris for 16 years, and when I lived on the Ile Saint Louis, the other island that's not the one with Notre Dame, and the Rothschilds lived there, and I would see them all the time, and I always thought they're the successful version of old age. I mean, they're so beautiful. They go out every night. They're so trim. They're so perfect. And I always looked at them with admiration. And in a way, that's when I think about the person that Ruggiero is based on, I mean, of course, I can be resentful because he left me. But on the other hand, I can't imagine a bad fate for him because he is perfect. I mean, he's handsome, he's talented, he's very, very smart, and he's a musician, and he's lots of other things that I don't describe in the book.
I love I don't know when you started this book. I mean, if it was before the pandemic, but the isolation that Constance and Vergero seem to have with one another, writing and reading these memoirs to one another. I mean, there's I think it's Ruggiero breaks his leg and then begins this. But was this a conceit that came to you in the isolation of the pandemic, where you were just talking endlessly to your husband, Michael Carroll, about things? I mean, it seems like a pandemic conceit, and yet it has a universality that
Oh,
a loving couple would talk.
You're very kind. I know. I mean, I actually have a friend who, I mean, everything is I'm so uninventive. I have a friend who lives in St. Moritz and has a magnificent chalet, and who lives just a block away from where Nietzsche lived. So everything is just a carbon copy. But yes, I mean, I did feel their isolation, and I do feel that they're trying to break through to each other. I mean, I think partly because of her past, but she has such fears of being abandoned, even by him. And he does, eventually she abandons him because she can't bear the tension of waiting for him to abandon her. Anyway, I don't know, but
talk about insanity. I mean,
yeah.
But one of the reasons I asked that, I mean, is just as I have wondered a little bit ago about how much of your emotional life is through all of the characters. I wanted to read to you something you say, or have Ruggiero say about himself. I'm always slow on the uptake and scarcely notice when people are flirting with me. And I wondered if that was true of you, because as I said before we began, I was going to read a note from someone who had a crush on you 50 years ago, who I was talking to, coincidentally yesterday, and then your name came up and he wrote me this note. So were you a person, or are you a person who barely knows when someone is flirting with you?
Yes, I mean, my old agent, Maxine Grofsky, once said to me not so long ago, we were all in love with you. And I said, I never had any idea of that. And I mean, I always had this kind of oppressed outsider image of myself. But I know once a drag queen said to me, "Oh, Edmund, you're the universal ball," and I that was so far from my self-image that I was astonished and, of course, flattered.
But well, that's in the book. I love that. You say, the few friends from Rome or London days whom I still see tell me that everyone was in love with me back then, male and female. In England, one of them said, "Universal ball. everyone wanted you, but you seemed oblivious to our nods and winks. And so I wanted to tell you about a nod and a wink from 50 years ago. This man who now lives in LA said, "Oh, Ed White. I met him years ago before he was Ed White, when he was sharing an office with a pal of mine at the Saturday Review. An instant crush. For a while there, when he was just a lad, he had a great haircut, short on the top, short on the sides, full on the top, much like a lot of hairstyles today. It was the look I wanted. I carried a pic of him with that haircut to I don't know how many barbers asking for that cut. It just never worked with my hair, but the crush went on."
Who is that?
His name is Phil Curtis. I hope he doesn't mind that I'm saying this. He didn't think that you would remember him. He was a friend of Jim Gaines. He may have never even, introduced himself to you by name. He was a friend of a colleague of yours, Jim Gaines at Saturday Review. And
yes, who became the editor of People magazine years later, and who was himself a charming boy and a nice straight boy with braces and kind of nerdish, whom I sent down to interview Tennessee Williams in Key West, and it was an instant hit. I was always good at that kind of matchmaking. Like when I was at Saturday Review, we did a cover story on Nabokov, and they wanted to send Henri Cartier-Bresson, and I said, "Oh, don't be silly. He doesn't want to meet another great artist. He wants to meet an aristocrat. Send Lord Snowden," which we did, and they got along so well. And Nabokov clowned for him and even pretended to be Borges.
oh my God, that should have been a scene in The Crown. I have no idea why they left that out. That's a marvelous. They have to go back, and that maybe is a deleted scene from one of the seasons of The Crown. That's fabulous.
Yeah, he was really, he chased butterflies and wore shorts, and was totally endearing with Lord Snowden, because I think that's what he really liked, not another great artist.
Because he was a snob.
Well, he was himself an aristocrat, and he had a gay uncle who left him millions and millions of rubles, like in 1908 or something. And then by the time, but he didn't want to spend that money or show it off, because he was in love with a girl from the People. And so he never spent any of that money. And then the revolution came and he never had that money again, but he never cared about the revolution. He said, people imagine that I feel bad about having lost my fortune and title, but he said, I couldn't care less.
So I know that Nabokov was a great admirer of Forgetting Elena. Did you actually meet him in person? Did you?
No, I never did. I had a shrink at the time who wanted me to fly to Switzerland and to meet him, but I was too shy. And I didn't do it, but I did communicate with him because we did this cover story, and he wrote a nice little article for me, and then when his article came in, it had lots of little mistakes in it, and in English, and so I thought, oh God, what am I going to do? So I had the whole thing set in type exactly as he'd written it. Then I did my edited version and had that set in type. And then I sent both copies to him, and he wired back, your version perfect.
Oh.
So it was just tiny little different changes that you would do, or, any editor would have done.
But it was nerve-wracking to do for Nabokov.
Exactly, yeah.
Well, one of the things I want to talk about in this book, is Ruggiero, Constance, they're looking back. And of course, then, as we've discussed, Edmund White is also looking back on this affair that you had. In fact, the dedication sums it up. You would dedicate it to Quinn, and to the memory of a great love. I mean, which of course is the person that you are alluding to or had mentioned. But what I found interesting is, so in so many of your books, I mean, whether it's A Boy's Own Story or Our Young Man, which is the novel that the lover, the young lover Ruggiero, is drawn to Edmund White through reading that book and then reading his other books, are about the past, are about an earlier part of your life, an earlier part of gay history. I mean, in the trilogy that began with A Boy's Own Story, and what you have Constance say, and I thought it was very moving, and I hope I'm not reading too much into it, that there's a difference between these things. But she says at one point to Ruggiero, she says she remembered he'd said he, quote, detested nostalgia. But at another point, another character says to him, but I remember you always liked the past. And it made me think very differently about how looking back can be an excavation of the past, or in a deep, meaningful way, or a kind of cheap patina of nostalgia, which is a kind of lazier way of looking back or thinking about your earlier life or earlier times. I mean, is there that difference?
I think there is. I mean, I can't claim to have been aware of it, but I mean, I do think, I mean, because I wrote a biography of Jean Genet, the French writer, and he hated nostalgia, and that was one of his big enemies. And once when a German journalist interviewed him, he said, "Why do you never talk about your 5 novels?" And he said, because I don't want to repeat myself. I don't want to think about the past in that way, and or try to be the person I was when I wrote Our Lady of the Flowers or whatever. But anyway, I do think that's the difference. I mean, that, like, it's sort of like Prokofiev's Classical Symphony, which is redolent of Haydn and Mozart, and yet it's very sharp and angular and sounds, it could only have been written in the 20th century. And I think that's a kind of good model, or even like Picasso's re-renderings of lots of masterpieces toward the end of his life. I think that well, Nabokov himself said that imitation is death, parody is life. And I don't think imitation is quite the word, but anyway, I think that's what you can see what he means, that like if you just take over wholesale something from the past, it's pretty sterile. But if you try to reimagine the past and even attribute it to imaginary characters, as I've done in this book, or even in A Saint from Texas, it feels fresher, I think, I hope.
Well, I want to talk about the act of writing. I mean, in that way, I mean, you've mentioned Nabokov, Genet. I mean, I of course thought of when you were quoting Nabokov, I thought of, I think it's T.S. Eliot, or it's been ascribed to many people, who said something like, well, bad writers copy, great writers steal. I mean, so it's similar in that way. I mean, if you can make something new of it. But within the novel, when Constance is telling us, or telling Ruggiero, and we happen to be hearing, I mean, since it's a book written for one person, is telling the story of her marriage and her earlier life. She's married to a writer named Howard Bunch, I think is his name. I mean, HB, who seems, I mean, I'm not sure everyone knows who this writer is, but it was pretty clear that it was the writer Harold Brodkey, and who at one point was acclaimed, mainly before he had written very much, as an American Proust. And were you friends with him? I mean, or did you know
Yes,
him
I
well?
was. I was. And I mean, it was a kind of stormy relationship, like most of his. But I mean, for instance, he read the proofs of A Boy's Own Story, and he called my editor and said, "Stop the presses. White has stolen my style."
Oh, so that's true. That's wonderful.
Yeah, and I mean, he was, and then but he would make good suggestions. Also, I mean, I think he was. I mean, what as I sort of suggest in that chapter, that he was somebody whose first drafts were marvelous, and then he had the curse of buying one of the early computers, the kind that filled up the entire apartment. That you had to have a technician from IBM come in to set it up, and then he just rewrote and rewrote and rewrote and ruined his own work. But he had been cited by many people as the Proust of our day. And in Hemingway's The Garden of Eden, the writer Hemingway and his wife are living in the wrong, what was then considered the wrong season on the Riviera, the summer, and they both get very, very tan, like mahogany, and they dye their hair white. And she goes and has her hair cut by his barber, and they pose for photos together. And that's just exactly what this writer, who I shouldn't talk about by name, and his wife did. They posed exact for the cover of New York Magazine as almost like twins.
So when he said that to stop the presses, I mean, Edmund White has stolen my style. Was he joking? Was he serious?
No, he was serious, and he was always serious. I think. I mean, he almost never joked, and he one time he said to Susan Sontag, "Well, you and I, Susan, are the two greatest writers of the 20th century." And she said, "Are you sure?" She said, "I think there are other great writers, like, well, Nabokov." And he said, "Well, Nabokov at least had the courtesy to acknowledge his debt to me." And she said, "Really? Where does he do that?" "Well," he says, "you remember Lolita's father is called Harold." I mean, he was really loony, but he was endearing and I think talented. I mean, his stories in a semi-classical mode are really great. And I mean, those things that were in the New Yorker. And it's too bad that he spoiled his novel, but I think he was an important figure.
But when you talk, I mean, it was the process of writing that you talk about, is that the endless revisiting, the tireless retouching. I mean, so is that something I remember from our last conversation about A Saint from Texas, that's something you don't do, that you don't do that kind of endless tinkering. So I'm hoping you can tell me a little bit about how you do write. I mean, because in this book in particular, as I say, the structure seems very complex, often very quick shifts of focus from one head to the other. I mean, and there's a lot of cross-cutting in that way to undercut everything that you've told us before, in the voice of the other character. And that seems to take a fair amount of careful looking anyway.
Well, I spend a lot of time on the couch daydreaming, and that's what Flaubert called his marinade. And I think a marinade is a good thing for a writer to do. One time, Francine Duplessis Gray was on the beach with Ned Rorem, and she was trying to learn Shakespeare's sonnets through earphones, memorize them while doing sit-ups. And Ned said, Francine, have you never heard that creativity begins in indolence? And anyway, so I'm pretty good at the indolence part. And I do think about, I used to write by hand, and that gave me the chance when I was dictating it to a typist to kind of rearrange and rewrite lots of it, and also figure out if it sounded right, if there were unintentional internal rhymes and things. But anyway, now I write directly on the computer, but I oftentimes daydream late at night, like 2 a.m, about the novel I'm working on, and I write little notes to myself, and then I scoop them up in the morning, and I try to integrate them. And so I somewhere I said, writing a novel is like having a love affair. It ties your days together. And because, everything is so discrete and kind of boringly sequential in life otherwise. But if you're writing a novel, it kind of ties your days together. And a bad love affair especially is good for that.
As this book proves. I want to ask you a few questions about the past that I hope are not cheap nostalgia or whatever. But this is 40 years ago. You published A Boy's Own Story from 40 years ago, and also 40 years ago this month. So it would have been 40 years ago this month. You were one of the founders of GMHC, and so I'm just hoping you can tell us a little bit about that time, that moment, your first awareness of AIDS, and what you weren't involved with GMHC for long, but very crucially you were.
Yeah, the first time, Larry Kramer, who had a very beautiful apartment on Fifth Avenue, he convoked a whole bunch of us to his apartment, which was like an early example of industrial design. With carpets on the walls and big metallic overhead lamps and things. Anyway, and a beautiful view of Washington Square. And so he convoked, I don't know, about 30 of us or more. And he had Dr. Friedman Keene, who was a research doctor, speak to us. And he said, there's this deadly disease called, well, at that time it was called GRID, gay-related immunodeficiency, but then it came to be called AIDS. And he told us all about it, and nobody, even he didn't know how it was really communicated at that point. It was only later, was it communicated by mosquitoes or mustaches or poppers or what, we didn't know. But anyway, he did say at that meeting, I think you guys should all stop having sex. And a kind of chill ran through the room, because we were all in our 20s and 30s, and we'd just gone, well, it seemed to us that we had just gone through Stonewall, but it was, well, anyway, 10 years of gay liberation. And we thought that gay liberation was sexual liberation, and that we thought it was a God-given right to have as much sex as you possibly could. And so we were all disconcerted by his remarks. It turned out he was right. If you wanted to survive, you had to go underground. It's sort of like COVID in a way. They're so different because COVID affects everyone, and it's not really dependent on particular acts, except maybe if you go to rock and roll concerts. But anybody can get contagious. And whereas AIDS was very limited to certain populations, and the rest of the world was pretty indifferent at first, at least. And then later, people got together and raised money for us all. But anyway, it took a long time for people to really understand the importance of AIDS. And Larry, whose biography you're writing now, really led the armies in that. It was his great feat that he did.
And how did you become involved with the six, as one of the six men who founded GMHC?
I think I was actually the first president, but I don't know why, because I have no executive abilities, and I guess I just agreed to do it and nobody else wanted to do it. But then very soon I didn't like what it was doing to my personality, because when you have for me, when I had a position of authority, I became a tyrant, which I'd never been before. And I was like, shut up, and I'm trying to move this meeting along, and I was really impossible. And so then I thought, I don't like this side of myself, and I want to be a writer. I don't want to be a cheerleader of this group. So I moved to Paris, and although right there I got involved again, because I was good friends with the philosopher Michel Foucault, and he died from AIDS, and so did my translator, Gilles Barbadet. And anyway, so with Foucault's surviving lover, his widower, I helped to start their AIDS group, ED, AIDS, ED, and but I didn't play a very important role in it, but a slight role at the very beginning.
And do you remember the first person you knew who died of AIDS?
There were so many. I'm trying to think. I had quite a few lovers who died of it, and I always felt guilty. Like, did I get? Because I've been positive since 1985, but I'm still here, as they say in Follies. And I think I must have had one of the two things that you need to prevent AIDS. If you have both, you're a non-progressor. But if you only have one, you're a slow progressor, as I was. I mean, my T cells would drop every year, but only marginally. And by the time they were really low, they had brought on the new therapies. So I remember in 1985, I discovered I was positive, and in those days, it really was a death sentence. And I thought, oh, I'll be dead in a year or two. But my great French lover, Hubert Saurin, died of AIDS, and I went through it with him every inch of the way. I remember some of my friends early on who had AIDS, I sort of neglected, but I kept thinking to myself, someday I'll have to go through the whole thing. And with Hubert, I did go through the whole thing.
And you have a character, an affair that Constance has with a man named Hubert, or maybe she's married to him. And I wondered if that was a tribute to your own Hubert. I don't remember exactly what Hubert in this book does, but he's an incidental character.
Yeah, I don't know. Probably I just grabbed at the name. I mean, I like it because Edmund and Hubert, in French, Edmond and Hubert, they sound so old-fashioned, like Rothschilds in the 19th century. And so everybody always laughed at our names together.
I mean, you mentioned Larry and his apartment, and the reason I had been interviewing Phil Curtis, the person who had a crush on you when you worked at Saturday Review, was that he knew Larry, and there are letters that Larry wrote him in 1981 that are among Larry's papers, which describe a lot about New York at that time, before anybody knew about AIDS, but in the spring of 1981, just before. And in one letter to Phil, he writes about, Paul Popham, who also was later president, one of the founders of GMHC, looks just the same. But two of his Fire Island housemates died. One died of cancer, and then he says the other, Nick Rock, died of something that they couldn't find out what it was. And then, of course, a few months later, they realized that these men had died of AIDS, and so people had died before they even knew what it was. So that's why I was wondering about your friends. But I wanted to say about Larry, the other thing I learned from Phil in talking about Larry's apartment, because he also described how fabulous Larry's apartment was. I didn't know, I knew what the design of the apartment was, and Larry's apartment in the 70s was actually featured in the New York Times Magazine. But Phil said that it also had a curtain that you could draw around the bed, which I found very, a very intriguing detail.
Yes, and it of course, as a writer, I was so impressed by the books, because he would have beautifully bound complete sets of like all of Dickens and all of Conrad, and it seemed pretty marvelous. But I think he was quite rich, wasn't he?
At that time, he had a lot of money from being a screenwriter and having written Lost Horizon. Not a very good movie, but he made a lot of money from it, and his brother invested his money. But I remember you told me that I guess when you moved to Lafayette Street, that Larry gave you, or you took from Larry, a used air conditioner.
He sold it to me.
Oh, he sold it to you. I thought he gave it to you.
No, he sold it to me.
So,
but very cheap, and it was, as they say in French, a friend's price, un prix d'ami.
And then the thing that I think, we're getting close to the end, that I wanted to ask you about love is related to something that you told me about you and Larry. There's many differences that you had, and obviously we'll leave that for another lifetime.
Your book, yeah.
Those will. I know you had many disagreements with him, some quite profound, but you said about him, and it was also about you, that you. And I'm fascinated by the different ways in which you and he reacted to this early shaping experience. You said the thing you have to understand about people like Larry and me, who were raised on all of those Hollywood movies, is we have a very romantic idea of love. And I was very moved by that, because as I say, you couldn't be more different. You and Larry, in your fiction or in your lives, about how you found romance, what you did with it, how you found love. Can you say something about that?
Well, I think I'm what's called sex positive, and he was what's called sex negative. That is, I think he in his novel, his first novel, he was very wary of promiscuity, and I always agreed with my psychiatrist, Dr. Silverstein, that other people, the people who were having too much sex, were having more than you were. And I always felt like that was a true definition of promiscuity. But I don't know. I do think that, that Larry had a very romantic view of love, and he ended up with one of the great loves of his life, and that kind of buckling the buckle is something very rare. I think, there's a popular song that love the second time around is better, but I think for very few people is that true, that the same person re-enters your life as a great love later in life. And yet it didn't, Larry's. And I think that was a very romantic act and feeling and perspective on his part. And I'm still friends with my college lover and all the surviving lovers that I have.
Well, I mean, you too have, I mean, there's something, I mean, you said, you were sex positive in a way that, Larry wasn't, but I think that your fiction, I mean, your novels, and that they're autobiographical. I mean, there's a great romance in the I used this word before, the exuberant sexuality that's here, but that, even if it's a trick or a one-time.
Yeah. Well, I always say that, people are wrong if they imagine that anonymous sex isn't romantic, because I can remember, spending the night with some wonderful person at the baths and not knowing his name or anything about him really, but feeling so tenderly toward him. And Genet once said, "I've never experienced desire in its pure form." He meant without feelings. And that he always was kind of romantic about his tricks too.
Well, I mean, as I've said, there's so much sexuality, just so happy on the page, and we feel all of these sensations. But I before we close, I want to say that you're about the sex positivity. I think it's Ruggiero who says, because he's Sicilian, that no, that he's with a woman who thinks that any erection is a subhuman mistake. And he says, no Sicilian can live like that. We're not obsessed with sex, but we have an unneurotic relationship to pleasure. So would you say that that's true of you, that you have an unneurotic relationship to pleasure?
No, I mean, I'm pretty neurotic, I think, but and almost all my relationships are pretty neurotic, um, but I can appreciate that quality in others.
Well, you certainly do on the page, because I took that to be, sort of what's going on in the Farewell Symphony and other books. I mean, is the eventual unneurotic enjoyment of pleasure. But I guess if you weren't neurotic, you wouldn't be a novelist. So
Right. I mean, you have to be outside something to be able to see it, I think.
well, and that's a wonderful thing in the book. I mean, is how your Ruggiero, I mean, is as he says, when he's telling the story of him having sex, he's both the perceived and the perceiver, because he's mediated through Constance's and I suppose other people's vision of himself, and the way he's outside and watching and doing, the perceiver and the perceived. It seems to me that in this book you have that same perspective on your life and on sexuality itself.
Well, that's a wonderful compliment. I hope that's true. Anyway, yes, I hope so. I mean, if I sound kind of weirdly abashed, it's after that horrible bashing of those English reviews, which just ridiculed me so entirely. I mean, I've never been treated like that. But anyway, I'm sure they liked my last novel, and they'll probably like the next. It's just, in England, you're up or you're down.
I remember when I almost at the same year, I mean, slightly after I interviewed you for Publishers Weekly, I interviewed Gore Vidal, who lived in Italy at the time, but would come, and he had a room at the Plaza. It was about his book Lincoln, and I remember feeling like no matter what question I asked, he was just answering whatever he wanted to say, and I felt like, oh, am I completely invisible here? I mean, and yet he said so many interesting things that when I wrote the interview up, it was actually the most, it was a wonderful interview. And I thought, oh, well, he really knew what he was doing. But what he said was complaining about reviewers, that what they had said about many of his books, especially recent books. And he said, oh, they only read, the first 10 pages of my books and, say how terrible they are, and anything they quote, stand out like diamonds in their prose. But then he said, when they review me, they say, "Here comes trouble." But I much prefer that to getting degrees from Harvard every year.
I know when the American Academy of Arts and Letters offered him a membership, he said, "I already have a membership to Diners Club."
So, did you turn down your membership to the American Academy? I don't think so.
No, I accepted it gratefully. And actually, unlike the French Academy, it actually has good writers in it. I mean, I think that if you look at the list of writers in the American Academy, they're pretty much the ones that you and I would agree were probably the better ones in America. And, whereas if you read through the list of French academicians, it's a bunch of nobodies. I mean, admirals and boring things like that, not really writers.
Well, you've piqued my curiosity about some of these British reviews, but I'm going to ask everyone who is listening to this conversation not to read any British newspapers as easily as available as they might be on the web, and only to read American reviews, which I think have been very, very positive. And certainly my review is a very positive one for what it's worth. So,
oh, it's worth a lot. And thank you.
So I guess, we have, we've reached the end of our time. And so I'm hoping that the next, you said to me that you're writing a new novel now. So, when you finish that one, we'll meet again, I hope in person.
Okay, good. I hope so. This could be a regular date.
Right, exactly. Well, thank you for this. And thank you for writing A Previous Life. I loved it. So.
Well, thank you, Billy. I really appreciate it.
Thank you to both Bill and Edmund for that wonderful and also at the same time gossipy conversation. I don't think we've ever had such a salacious kind of thing here. So if you missed the beginning of tonight's event and you want to catch up with it, or you want to share it with a friend, there will be a recording posted right after. You can also catch up on our previous events on the Paula Cooper Gallery Studio page right here, including Bill and Edmund's previous event. We have the book at 192 Books. If you'd like to reserve a copy, you can give us a call or send us an email at info@192books.com to put one aside for you. You can also just come by for your safe and socially distanced browsing every day from 11 to 7. If you can't make it down to Chelsea, you can also order the book from our bookshop.org page for direct shipment. Check our website, 192books.com, for more information on upcoming events. And thanks again to Edmund White and Bill Goldstein, and have a great night, everyone. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Evan.
Thank you.